The weight of her responsibilities rested heavily on her shoulders, tending to patients, dealing with constant deadlines, and managing the emotional demands of her work. Yet, despite the exhaustion, she always found time to smile. It wasn't just her job,
the emotional demands
it was
of her work.
calling. Sarah
Yet,
was known
despite
for her
the exhaustion,
kind-hearted nature and
she
her
always
ability
found
to bring
time to
comfort
smile.
to even the most difficult.
wasn't managing the emotional
It
demands
was
of
behind the warmth she shared with others. Sarah carried a quiet loneliness of her own. Her small apartment felt empty when she returned after a long shift, and her phone rarely rang with messages that didn't come from work. She dreamed of a life where she wasn't just a nurse on call, but someone who truly connected with others outside the walls of the hospital. But every time she thought of pursuing those dreams, the reality of her exhausting schedule weighed her down. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Sarah found herself assigned to care for Mr. Thomas, an elderly man who had been admitted with a fractured hip. He was quiet, withdrawn, and far too proud to admit how lonely he felt. His children lived far away, and his wife, the love of his life, had passed away years ago.
how lonely he felt.
As Sarah sat by his
children lived
bedside,
far
offering
away,
him
and his
comfort
wife,
and
the love of his
companionship,
life, had
something
passed away
shifted.
years ago.
She
How
wasn't
lonely
just a
he
nurse
felt.
doing her
Sarah sat by
job.
his bedside,
She was the
far
only
away, and his
person
wife-
who seemed to care for him at that moment.
and
And
companionship.
unknown to
His
Sarah,
wife
that
passed away
small
years
act of
ago. She
kindness would
wasn't
change her
just a
life
nurse.
forever. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Echoes of Truth. Today, I'm thrilled to bring you a new story that will touch your heart and make you see life in a different light. As Sarah walked down the hospital hallway, the weight of the day's work weighed on her. The steady hum of the machines and the soft chatter of her colleagues were all too familiar, but her mind couldn't help but drift to the thought of Mr. Thomas. Something about him tugged at her heart. It wasn't just his age or his condition, it was the loneliness she could see in his eyes. The kind of loneliness that wasn't easy to fix. That day, as her shift was nearing its end, she found herself standing at his door once more. His room was dimly lit, the rain outside tapping softly against the window. The silence in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating.
Unknown to Sarah, that
Mr.
small
Thomas
act of
was
kindness
staring out
would
the
change her
window,
life forever.
his hands
Hello,
folded in his
everyone.
lap, not
Welcome
moving.
to Echoes of Truth.
Sarah hesitated
Today,
for a
I'm
moment,
thrilled to bring
then
you a new
quietly
story
entered
that
the
will
room.
touch your heart and make you see
"How are you
life
feeling
in a
today,
different
Mr.
light."
Thomas?"
As
she
Sarah
asked, her voice gentle.
walked
He
down
turned
the
his head
hospital hallway,
slowly,
the weight of
offering her a faint smile, but his eyes quickly returned to the window. He didn't speak for a while, as if gathering his thoughts. When he did speak, his voice was low, almost breaking with the weight of unspoken words. "It's just hard, you know. The silence, the loneliness. It hit Sarah like a wave. His words, so raw and honest. She knew what it felt like to be surrounded by people but still feel alone. To be the one always giving, always helping, but never receiving the same in return. But she couldn't let him feel that way, not today. She pulled a chair closer to his bed and sat down. "You don't have to go through this alone," she said softly, her hand resting on his. "I'm here with you." Mr. Thomas didn't respond right away. Instead, his eyes softened, as if he were deciding whether or not to let himself believe her. Then, for the first time, he spoke with a bit more warmth. "I've spent so many years alone. Sometimes, I think I've forgotten how to connect." Sarah felt a pang in her chest. She could see that he wasn't just talking about his physical pain, it was the emotional ache that weighed him down. She wished there was more she could do, but in that moment, something stirred inside her. An urge to stay longer, to be the person who could give him a little bit of peace. She smiled and nodded. "We can start by talking. I'm a good listener." Her voice was calm, but inside, her heart raced. She knew this moment was more than just a simple conversation. Something inside her told her that this was a turning point. For him, and for her. As they sat together, talking about the weather, his family, and old memories, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something bigger. Little did she know, that simple act of sitting with Mr. Thomas would set in motion a chain of events that would change her life forever. After Sarah's brief conversation with Mr. Thomas, she couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was unfolding. As she walked down the hospital hallway, her thoughts kept returning to his words. There was an undeniable weight to his sadness, an unspoken truth behind the gentle loneliness in his eyes. She had sensed it before, but now, something felt different. She wasn't sure if it was his vulnerability or her own growing sense of responsibility, but she felt a connection with him that went beyond her usual nurse-patient bond. That evening, as Sarah sat at her desk in her small, quiet apartment, preparing for another grueling day at the hospital, her phone buzzed. A message flashed on the screen. "He isn't who you think he is." The cryptic words sent a chill down her spine. It was from an unknown number, with no additional explanation. Her heart raced as she stared at the message, trying to make sense of it. She had no idea who it could be from, or why someone would send such an ominous message about Mr. Thomas. But one thing was clear. It felt like a warning, a piece of a puzzle she had yet to understand. Before she could process it any further, her phone rang. The caller ID showed no name, just an unfamiliar number. She hesitated for a moment, but her curiosity got the better of her. Sarah answered the call, her voice tentative. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was low and distorted, almost as if someone was trying to disguise it. "You need to stay away from him. It's not what it seems." The line went dead before she could respond. Sarah felt a wave of unease wash over her. Who was this person, and why did they seem so desperate to warn her about Mr. Thomas? The fact that the caller had mentioned staying away from him only deepened her concern. Mr. Thomas was an elderly man, frail and vulnerable. Why would anyone want her to distance herself from him? Unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right, Sarah decided to investigate further. But she was careful not to alarm anyone at the hospital. She hadn't mentioned the strange message or the unsettling call to anyone. After all, what could she say? That someone had warned her about Mr. Thomas without giving any reason why? The next day at the hospital, Sarah found herself glancing over her shoulder more than once. There was a subtle, nagging sensation that she was being watched. She couldn't quite pinpoint the source, but she couldn't shake the feeling. As she entered Mr. Thomas's room, she noticed a figure standing by the nurse's station, watching her closely. It was a tall man dressed in a long, dark coat. His face was partially obscured, but his eyes seemed to follow Sarah's every move. She tried to push the unsettling thoughts aside and focused on her patient. Mr. Thomas, sitting by the window, was staring outside again, his gaze distant and lost. The heavy silence in the room made it feel as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. She couldn't explain it, but she felt an odd sense of urgency. Something in the air had shifted. As Sarah sat down next to Mr. Thomas, she couldn't help but notice the way his hands trembled slightly, as if there was more to his frailty than just his age. She had seen it before, the subtle signs of a person burdened by a secret they weren't willing to share. But with him, it felt like there was more at play, like a story that was waiting to be uncovered. "Mr. Thomas, are you feeling all right today?" she asked gently, trying to gauge his mood. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, they were silent, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air between them. "I've been thinking," he said finally, his voice low and hesitant, "about the past, and the things I never said." Sarah nodded, her curiosity piqued. She wanted to ask more, to understand what he meant, but she sensed it wasn't the right moment. There was something behind his words, something he was too afraid to confront. But what was it? As she watched him, Sarah caught sight of the dark-coated man once again. This time standing by the window, his gaze fixed on Mr. Thomas's room. Her heart skipped a beat. Who was he? Why was he lingering around the hospital, especially near Mr. Thomas? Her instincts told her something was wrong, but she couldn't explain why. As much as she wanted to ignore the strange occurrences, Sarah's gut told her that they were all connected. The message, the phone call, the mysterious man. It was all pointing in one direction, but she wasn't sure where. Just as she began to stand up and leave, the man in the dark coat disappeared down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Sarah's mind raced as she thought about the strange series of events. Could he be connected to Mr. Thomas's past? Or was he just a coincidence? As she made her way back to the nurse's station, her phone buzzed again. Another cryptic message. "You're too close. Don't get involved." Her hands trembled as she stared at the screen. Who was sending these messages? And why were they so adamant about keeping her away from Mr. Thomas? Was it because of his past? Or was there something more sinister at play? The pieces were starting to fall into place, but Sarah wasn't sure if she was ready for the truth that lay ahead. All she knew was that she couldn't turn back now. She had to dig deeper, even if it meant uncovering something that might change everything she thought she knew about Mr. Thomas and about herself. As Sarah continued to ponder the strange events surrounding Mr. Thomas, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was not just off, but deeply entangled with her own fate. She had always prided herself on being able to keep a clear head, especially in her work as a nurse, but the recent happenings left her uneasy. The cryptic messages, the disturbing phone call, and the mysterious man in the hospital. It all felt like a carefully orchestrated web she had unwittingly stepped into. But why? What was the connection? It wasn't long before the answers started to materialize, though not in the way Sarah expected. The following day at the hospital, she noticed something odd the moment she entered Mr. Thomas's room. The atmosphere felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened with anticipation. But it wasn't just the room. There was something different about Mr. Thomas, too. He was staring at the door as if waiting for someone, and his eyes, once distant and foggy, were now sharp, almost too alert. His gaze flicked over to Sarah with a mixture of recognition and something darker, a flash of hesitation. "Is everything all right, Mr. Thomas?" Sarah asked, trying to mask the worry creeping into her voice. He didn't immediately answer. Instead, his lips twitched as if he were fighting against something inside himself. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "They'll be here soon. You shouldn't be here when they arrive." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "We'll be here, Mr. Thomas," she pressed, trying to read the fear in his eyes. But before he could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. A figure stepped into the room, a woman Sarah didn't recognize. She was tall, with an air of confidence that seemed almost unnatural in the sterile environment of the hospital. The woman's eyes immediately locked onto Sarah, studying her with a cold, calculating gaze that sent a shiver down her spine. Sarah instinctively took a step back. "Excuse me, but I'm looking for Mr. Thomas," the woman said, her voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "Is this his room?" "Yes, but—" Sarah began. But before she could finish, the woman pushed past her, moving straight toward Mr. Thomas. Sarah watched in stunned silence as the woman spoke in hushed tones to him. She couldn't hear the conversation, but the intensity of their exchange was palpable. Mr. Thomas seemed tense, his hands fidgeting on his lap, his eyes darting around the room nervously. The woman, however, remained calm, almost too calm. What was going on? Who was this woman? And why was she here, acting as though she had every right to be in the room? Sarah's thoughts were interrupted when the woman turned back to her, her expression unreadable. "You're in the way," the woman said coolly. "Leave us." The words stung, but Sarah's curiosity only deepened. She had no intention of backing down now. She had to know what was happening. As she hesitated, the woman's gaze softened, though there was still an undercurrent of something unsettling in her eyes. "Do you know what Mr. Thomas really is?" the woman asked, her voice lowering as if she were sharing a secret. But before Sarah could respond, the door opened again, this time with more force. Another figure entered, this time a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his presence enough to make the already tense atmosphere more oppressive. He moved toward Mr. Thomas with a purposeful stride. The woman stepped aside, her eyes following him closely. This was no ordinary visitor. There was something about the way they both interacted with Mr. Thomas that felt calculated. For a moment, Sarah felt completely out of place. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls growing taller, the air thicker. It was as if she had stumbled into a world that wasn't meant for her. And yet she couldn't tear herself away. The uncertainty, the curiosity, it was all too much. She had to understand. But just as the man and woman began speaking to Mr. Thomas in hushed voices, their conversation interrupted by a sudden, chilling silence. Door slammed shut. A dark figure, barely visible in the dim hallway light, was standing there. The weight of what was happening suddenly pressed down on Sarah. The twist, the strange visitors, the tension, it was all too much. It felt like a game, and she was trapped in the middle, with no clear way out. What did they want with Mr. Thomas? What had he been hiding all these years? As the silence enveloped the room, Sarah realized that she had crossed a line. She had gone from merely caring for her patient to becoming part of something much bigger than she could have ever imagined. The pieces of the puzzle still incomplete were beginning to fall into place. Only now, the mystery was even deeper and the truth more elusive than ever. As Sarah stood there, her mind racing to connect the pieces of this growing puzzle. She couldn't shake the feeling that the answer she desperately needed were just within reach. Every cryptic message, every strange visitor, and every word from Mr. Thomas seemed to direction. How round big glaze, as though he had, as though Eileen said, silence, weary out along as him for his ended up not and sharpened. He's like she was for Anne's face. It's true, the man confirmed. Mr. Thomas built an empire, and his son, your employer, carries on his name. But after a fallout that no one speaks of, Mr. Thomas disappeared, leaving behind a fortune, a legacy, and a family who believed him to be dead. He didn't disappear out of choice. He was driven away by forces that sought to exploit his name, his wealth, and now you're caught in the middle. Sarah's mind spun as she tried to process the revelation. The man she had been caring for wasn't just another patient, he was the key to the hospital's history, the estranged patriarch of a family empire. And you, the woman added, her tone softening for the first time, have unknowingly become his greatest ally. By standing by him, you've given him a second chance to reclaim what was lost, and he plans to reward you for that loyalty. Mr. Thomas nodded, his voice heavy with emotion. You didn't just save my life, Sarah. You've given me a reason to believe in people again. When the time is right, I'll make sure you're taken care of. But for now, you must decide whether to walk away or stand with me as I face the family I left behind. Sarah's heart pounded. She had thought she was just a nurse, but now she stood at the center of a story much larger than herself. And as she looked into Mr. Thomas's eyes, she realized that her choice would shape not just her future, but the fate of an entire legacy. The decision Sarah made would change her life forever. After the truth about Mr. Thomas was revealed, she discovered her inner strength and realized that every decision has a significant impact. She not only faced her fears, but also stepped onto a path that was unknown to her. Sarah recognized the importance of her work, and, beyond that, understood that she was not just a nurse, but a part of a story where her role mattered. This decision gave her a new life, one where she not only faced Mr. Thomas's secrets, but also gained the strength to help him. Her loyalty, sacrifice, and honesty gave her a position she had never dreamed of. The core lesson of this story is that no decision in life should ever be taken lightly, because every action has far-reaching consequences. Sarah proved that when you confront your fears and make the right choices, not only do you achieve personal success, but you can also bring about change in the lives of others. Every path in life begins a new story, and sometimes taking a step forward is all it takes to change everything. What did you take away from Sarah's journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring content. Your support helps us create more stories that matter. Every day, Sarah, a dedicated nurse in her mid-30s, woke up before dawn, greeted by the quiet hum of the early morning. The weight of her responsibilities rested heavily on her shoulders, tending to patients, dealing with constant deadlines, and managing the emotional demands of her work. Yet, despite the exhaustion, she always found time to smile. It wasn't just her job, it was her calling. Sarah was known for her kind-hearted nature and her ability to bring comfort to even the most difficult of patients. But behind the warmth she shared with others, Sarah carried a quiet loneliness of her own. Her small apartment felt empty when she returned after a long shift, and her phone rarely rang with messages that didn't come from work. She dreamed of a life where she wasn't just a nurse on call, but someone who truly connected with others outside